What if the stories we've told ourselves about the past were only part of the truth? In dusty textbooks and classroom walls, history is laid out like a straight road, a smooth, predictable path from stone tools to smartphones, from cave paintings to skyscrapers. But what if beneath that tidy timeline lie cracks? Quiet, inconvenient cracks, through which a different version of the past tries to whisper. This is not a story of conspiracies or villains, but of questions. Of scientists who uncovered things they weren't supposed to. Of forgotten cities buried under jungle canopies. Of footprints too old, too large, and too human to fit into the evolutionary boxes we've built. This is the story of 10 expeditions that didn't just challenge official history. They risked rewriting it. It begins along a quiet river in Texas, where in 1938, Dr. Roland Byrd walked beside a limestone bed exposed by drought. The footprints he found, deep, anatomically precise, unmistakably human, lay side by side with the clawed tracks of dinosaurs, embedded in the same ancient stone. If real, they meant that humans had walked the earth alongside creatures believed extinct for over 60 million years. Byrd's plaster casts preserved their shape, but the institutions he reported to preserved only silence. From there, the questions stretch across oceans. The Mediterranean Mapping Project, led by Columbia University's marine geology team in the 1950s and 60s, revealed cities, entire submerged cities lying beneath hundreds of feet of water. Straight streets, geometric foundations, artificial harbors. Civilization where none was supposed to exist. Their sonar scans told of a world sunken during the last ice age, long before Sumer or Egypt ever rose. But those images were locked away, funding vanished, and the sea resumed its quiet guardianship. And in Antarctica, where frozen silence conceals time itself, a Soviet expedition pulled from the ice cores something extraordinary. Perfectly preserved tropical plant fossils. Palm fronds, ferns, traces of insects that thrive only in warm, humid climates. Fossils dated to times when the continent should have been locked in eternal frost. It wasn't just a climate mystery. It was a reminder that even Earth's memory is unstable, that landscapes we thought fixed might once have lived in another skin. Across the Atlantic, the Norwegian adventurer Thor Heyerdahl built ancient-style vessels and crossed oceans with his crew. He wasn't chasing myths. He was testing them. Could ancient people have sailed from Africa to the Americas? Not only did they succeed, but along the way they found markers, signal stones, artificial harbors carved into lonely islands as if others had passed long ago. Each of these stories is real, not in the sense of being accepted, but in the sense of having occurred. They were documented, measured, challenged, and then silenced. Why? This series is not about proving what happened. It's about restoring space for the question. History, after all, is not just a record of what we know. It is also a reflection of what we are willing to consider. As we walk through these forgotten expeditions, from desert sands to Arctic ice, from jungle ruins to subterranean cities, we will not search for proof, but for understanding. We will not claim certainty. We will instead hold wonder, because sometimes the past isn't gone. It's only waiting for us to listen. And perhaps, in the quiet between accepted timelines, something extraordinary is still trying to be remembered. It started with a drought in Texas. In the summer heat of 1938, the Paluxy River ran low, bearing its limestone bed to the open sky. What emerged from the cracked stone wasn't just the shape of the ancient world, it was a collision of two worlds never meant to meet. Dr. Roland Byrd, a field researcher for the American Museum of Natural History, had come to verify reports of dinosaur tracks. What he found instead left even science uncertain of its own past. There, embedded in the same sediment as the three-toed impressions of Acrocanthosaurus, a theropod predator of the Cretaceous, were tracks that looked unmistakably human. Heel strikes, arches, toe separation. Not crude impressions, not suggestive smudges, but anatomically correct human footprints, some nearly 2 feet long. Bird was no amateur. He knew the terrain, the geology, the expectations. He also knew the implications. If these were real, they meant that humans, or something like them, had walked this earth 100 million years ago. The prints weren't random. They showed motion, direction, even hesitation, some stepping around dinosaur tracks as if avoiding them. They bore weight and stride patterns consistent with human locomotion. And they weren't in newer stone above the dinosaur tracks. They were in the same layer. The same moment, preserved in time. Bird collected casts, over 100 prints, meticulously documented. And yet, when he tried to bring them to public light, the doors of academia began to close. The museum declined to display the findings. Other paleontologists refused to even examine the casts. One geologist, Dr. Cecil Dougherty of UC Berkeley, lost tenure after speaking in support of the discovery. There was no grand conspiracy, only a quiet consensus that such things could not be. The prints were too impossible to be true, and so they were treated as if they weren't. Over time, many of the tracks were lost to erosion and vandalism. The clearest examples vanished. Casts once housed in museum basements disappeared without record. The site remains a curiosity, a roadside attraction. And yet beneath the surface of tourist footsteps, something ancient still lingers, a riddle not fully erased. Science demands rigor, but it also demands curiosity. The Paluxy River tracks challenge not just timelines, but our willingness to follow evidence where it leads, even when that path bends beyond what we thought possible. Were they hoaxes? Misidentified impressions? Or something else? A hint that our species, or one like us, might have touched this planet long before we think we did? The stone remembers. But do we listen? Or do we erase what doesn't fit, afraid not of being wrong, but of needing to rewrite the story entirely? The sea forgets slowly. Beneath the shimmering surface of the Mediterranean lies a world few ever imagined. Cities submerged, geometry carved into the ocean floor, streets that once echoed with life, now silenced by time and tide. Between 1955 and 1968, Columbia University's marine geology program embarked on what was meant to be a routine mapping project. Their goal was to trace ancient coastlines using sonar to understand how the sea had risen since the last ice age. What they found instead was civilization, sleeping beneath 400 feet of water. The sonar data was undeniable. Long, straight lines. Too perfect to be natural. Right angles spanning miles. Grid patterns that hinted at planning, not chaos. Central plazas, roadways, harbors. It was a city, no, cities, laid out with mathematical precision across vast stretches of the seafloor. Dr. Bruce Heen, who led the project, was stunned. The depths at which these structures lay meant they must have been built at least 12,000 years ago, during a time when, according to accepted history, humans were still scattered in tribal groups. Not yet farmers, certainly not architects, but the shapes on the sonar were unmistakable. They revealed structures akin to temples, palaces, marketplaces. There were breakwaters, defensive walls, and harbors carved into submerged bedrock. Some layouts followed astronomical alignments. Others mirrored the geometry of later civilizations, ratios, angles, axes, all pointing to a lost sophistication. When Heen's team attempted to publish their results, the resistance was swift. Funding was withdrawn. Archives were sealed. The National Science Foundation classified the research. Official statements framed the anomalies as natural formations. But what natural process carves square courtyards and arranges avenues like spokes of a wheel? Independent researchers trying to revisit the sites were denied access to the sonar data. Later mapping projects were steered around the same regions. Even now, official maritime charts list those zones as geologically unremarkable. But the sea does not lie. Beneath those depths is a story older than the pyramids, older than the Sumerians. It tells of people who mastered engineering and city planning at a time when humanity was supposedly still discovering the wheel. How did they vanish? Was it a flood, the kind spoken of in myths from every ancient culture? Or was it time itself, erasing what it couldn't explain? The Mediterranean mapping project was never officially concluded. It simply stopped. And yet, if you listen closely, beneath the hum of the sonar, you can still hear the echoes of stone streets underwater. The silence between the waves is not empty. It is full of questions. What have we forgotten beneath the tide? And what might we rediscover if we dared to look again? At the bottom of the world, silence reigns. Antarctica, a land of ice and wind, of permanence, or so we believed. But in 1980, a joint international research expedition drilled deep into its ancient ice, seeking climate records locked in layers of snow compacted over hundreds of thousands of years. What they found instead cracked open the very concept of frozen time. Dr. Elena Petrov, leading the Soviet contingent of the expedition, was no stranger to the extremes of polar science. Her team was pulling ice cores from depths corresponding to 400,000 years ago, layers presumed to be the untouched remnants of an age-long glaciation. But in one of those cores, entombed in what should have been lifeless ice, lay something impossible: fragments of tropical life, palm fronds, ferns, even flowering plants, preserved so perfectly that their cellular structures remained visible under a microscope. There was pollen, too, from plants that should never have survived in a land of perpetual frost. And more than flora, insect remnants, soil microbes, even traces of marine life that required warm waters to thrive. Carbon dating confirmed it. These weren't modern contaminants. They belonged to the era they were pulled from. Antarctica, at some point in deep history, had not just warmed, it had flourished. The implications rippled through the research team. If this continent had once supported lush ecosystems, then everything we thought we knew about Earth's climate cycles, about the pace of glaciation, about polar stability, might be wrong or incomplete. Geological analysis of surrounding sediment layers revealed signs of volcanic activity, sudden sea level shifts, and even patterns of crustal movement that hinted at a different continental configuration. Perhaps Antarctica hadn't always been at the pole, or perhaps the planet itself had shifted in ways we no longer understand. When Petrov prepared her findings for publication, the doors began to close. International climate agencies intervened. The Soviet Academy classified the data. Fossil samples were relocated to restricted facilities. Collaborating NASA researchers were told to omit the discovery from their reports. Suddenly, the drilling site was declared off-limits. Environmental protections were cited, but those protections seemed to appear only after the evidence threatened accepted models. What remains is a haunting absence, a silence where there once was discovery. No further expeditions have been allowed to drill in the same region. The records that do exist are fragmented, often missing the most compelling sections. But the ice remembers. Within its frozen layers, it holds a story of Earth not as a static world, but as a place in flux, capable of transformations more radical than we dare imagine. And if Antarctica once bloomed, what else have we overlooked? The past is not frozen. It only sleeps. And sometimes, when the drill reaches just deep enough, it stirs. The ocean has always seemed a barrier, vast, untamed, impassable. But what if, long before our maps and engines, it was a highway? In 1969, Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl launched a bold experiment. He set sail from Morocco aboard a boat made entirely with ancient Egyptian techniques. No modern tools, no engines. The vessel, named Ra-2, was modeled on papyrus ships depicted in Old Kingdom tombs. With a small international crew, Heyerdahl crossed the Atlantic, not by accident, but by design. But this voyage wasn't just about possibility. Along the way, his team found traces of something more astonishing, evidence that ancient peoples may have routinely crossed the oceans, thousands of years before recorded history admits. On remote islands, they discovered structures, not natural rock formations, but carefully placed stone markers aligned with stars, built as if to guide the way. Harbors carved into coastal stone and platforms for signaling ships across distances showed a kind of oceanic infrastructure. These weren't accidents of erosion. They were designed, intentional. Heyerdahl's team collected barnacles and marine specimens from their ship's hull. What they found in those tiny ecosystems shook them further. Combinations of marine life that suggested historical intermingling of species from distant continents, the biological footprint of repeated ancient crossings. The navigational evidence was equally compelling. Wind patterns, current systems, and the predictable rhythms of the sea formed a natural map. With the right knowledge, without needing compasses or sextants, sailors could move between worlds. And apparently, someone had. Most remarkable were the signs of human presence: warehouses for trade goods, astronomical observatories, and artifacts that pointed to a maritime network spanning continents. Not a single voyage, but a system. A memory of global exchange long before the age of sails. Heyerdahl's conclusions were radical, and the response was swift. Academic institutions dismissed his claims as romantic speculation. Universities withdrew support. Sites he'd identified were suddenly declared off-limits, protected by treaties. His evidence was shelved, reinterpreted, or ignored. But what if he was right? The mythology of disconnected ancient worlds begins to fray when you look closely. Across cultures, separated by oceans, we find similar symbols, architectural styles, star maps, and myths of visitors arriving from across the water. Coincidence, perhaps, or echo. Heyerdahl was not claiming aliens or magic, only that our ancestors were more capable, more connected than we give them credit for. His voyages proved the means existed. His discoveries hinted that the journeys had been made, and his legacy is a map not of certainty, but of curiosity. What if oceans were not the end, but the beginning? What if the first global network was built not on wires and satellites, but on wind, courage, and stars? And what would it mean if the memory of that network still whispers through the waves, waiting for us to remember how to listen? The desert hides its secrets well. In the vastness of the Sahara, where shifting sands stretch endlessly toward the horizon, it's easy to forget that this landscape was not always lifeless. But between 1975 and 1982, a joint French-Algerian expedition uncovered something extraordinary beneath the dunes. The ruins of cities older than history, buried not just in sand, but in silence. Led by archaeologist Henri Lot, the team began by studying Neolithic rock art, but what they found went far beyond simple cave drawings. Ground-penetrating radar revealed immense urban complexes, their outlines hidden beneath centuries of sand. These weren't crude encampments. They were cities with paved roads, drainage systems, multi-story buildings, and complex infrastructure. Carbon dating placed the structures around 8,000 BCE, thousands of years before the rise of Egypt. The implications were staggering. These ancient Saharan people had mastered architecture, astronomy, agriculture, and civic planning, while the rest of the world was presumed to be nomadic and primitive. The evidence was undeniable. Buildings oriented to celestial events, solstices, star alignments, revealed astronomical knowledge requiring generations of observation. Irrigation systems captured and stored seasonal rains, enabling agriculture in arid climates. Underground cisterns and aqueducts channeled water with precision. Their cities featured sewage systems and public gathering spaces designed not just for survival, but for society. Even metallurgy was present. Artifacts showed alloy casting, decorative filigree, and metal tools requiring high-temperature furnaces and chemical understanding. This wasn't just civilization. It was advanced civilization, thriving in what we had assumed was barren land. But the discovery challenged powerful narratives. Egyptian authorities were quick to dismiss it, fearing a shift in the story of African origin and dominance. If these desert cities came first, then Egypt might no longer be the cradle of African civilization. The French government, wary of post-colonial repercussions, restricted access. And so the evidence, so rich, so transformative, was quietly sealed. Modern satellite images show geometric patterns beneath the sand, aligned with Lata's coordinates. But ground access is now forbidden, protected under environmental and cultural preservation laws. Expeditions are blocked. Permits are denied. The cities remain untouched, as if their rediscovery must wait for another time. What lies buried beneath the Sahara is more than stone. It is the memory of a world that once flourished in a green desert, a world that defies our assumptions about where civilization begins. We think of history as a line, moving upward from simple to complex. But perhaps it is a tide, rising, falling, bearing, and revealing, in cycles. And perhaps the sand is not erasure but protection, shielding knowledge until we are ready to understand its weight. What other stories lie just beneath the surface, waiting for the wind to shift? The cold preserves what memory forgets. In 1973, a multinational team set out on an expedition to the Arctic, aiming to study climate change by analyzing layers of ancient permafrost. But what they unearthed in the frozen ground of Alaska and Siberia would challenge not just the science of weather, but the story of how humanity came to the Americas. Dr. James Mitchell, the lead archaeologist, didn't expect to find signs of human activity tens of thousands of years earlier than any textbook allowed. But there they were, tools, weapons, ornaments, and artwork buried deep beneath layers of earth supposedly untouched by human hands. The tools weren't primitive. They were crafted with skill, flint knives with standardized edges, composite weapons made from bone, wood, and resin. Decorations carved into antler and ivory showed intricate patterns and scenes of hunting life, revealing not just survival, but culture. Radiocarbon dating shattered expectations. The artifacts were over 45,000 years old, predating the Bering Land Bridge theory by nearly 30,000 years. According to conventional wisdom, humans weren't supposed to be there. But the permafrost held proof that they were. Even more astonishing were the signs of maritime technology. Fragments of boats, flexible hulls, stitched seams, evidence of sails, emerged from the ice, preserved as if time itself had paused. These were not rafts, but vessels built for long-distance travel across Arctic waters. They suggested that ancient peoples had braved oceans during an ice age, guided not by compasses but by stars, wind, and memory. The presence of navigational instruments, simple but effective tools for reading the sky and sea, hinted at a capability far beyond what was believed possible for the era. These people weren't merely surviving. They were moving, exploring, trading, perhaps even mapping. Mitchell and his team prepared to share their findings, ready to rewrite the chapter on early human migration. But before they could, funding vanished. Access was revoked. The National Science Foundation classified the site. Artifacts were relocated to government storage, and further research was quietly shelved. Academic resistance was fierce. To accept this evidence meant unraveling decades of established theory. The idea that humans had reached the Americas by boat tens of thousands of years before Clovis culture was treated not as science, but as heresy. Today, those Arctic sites are declared protected zones. Environmental and cultural laws prevent excavation. New research is discouraged. And still the ice remains, locking away its secrets, but not forever. History is often drawn with bold lines, but the true story of our species is written in fragments. Chipped stone, frozen wood, quiet echoes beneath the snow. If humans crossed into the Americas long before we thought, how much else have we underestimated? Perhaps our ancestors were not merely wanderers following herds, but explorers, driven by curiosity, guided by skill, and capable of more than we have dared to believe. The cold remembers, and so must we. Beneath London's modern streets lies another city, older, quieter, and until recently, forgotten. In 1987, during the construction of the Jubilee Line extension through central London, engineers stumbled upon something unexpected. As their drills pushed through layers of soil and stone, they uncovered tunnel systems far older than the Roman foundations they were expecting. And these tunnels weren't crude burrows or natural caverns, they were precise, engineered. Dr. Margaret Foster, the archaeologist brought in to consult, immediately recognized the anomaly. The tunnels had perfectly circular cross-sections, ventilation shafts, and support structures crafted with uncanny precision. The walls bore signs of stone-cutting techniques far more advanced than what was used in Roman Britain. Some bore tool marks suggesting machines or tools that defied the known technology of their presumed time. As the team mapped the underground network, they realized the complexity was staggering. The tunnels connected with natural caves and underground waterways in a manner that suggested intentional city planning. Reservoirs, drainage systems, airflow management. This wasn't random survival engineering, it was infrastructure. The materials told another story. Stone blocks cut and fitted so precisely they required no mortar. Metallurgical traces revealed alloys previously unknown in British prehistory, and more sophisticated than Roman equivalents. Some artifacts embedded in surrounding soil layers, dated to thousands of years before Caesar's armies ever touched British soil. As they dug deeper, both physically and historically, a picture emerged, an urban network beneath London, predating Roman occupation by millennia. A civilization that understood geology, hydrology, mathematics, and structural engineering to a level rivaling 19th century design. But this discovery posed a problem. If these tunnels were real and their dating accurate, then the entire narrative of Northern Europe's development would need rewriting. Roman superiority in urban engineering, the supposed civilizing of Britain, all would be called into question. And so, quietly, pressure mounted. Foster's reports were shelved. The London Transport Authority restricted access to the tunnels. Heritage laws were invoked not to protect the site, but to prevent further excavation. Official documents referred to the structures as natural features with coincidental alignment. The extension project was rerouted. Today, those tunnels remain, sealed and silent. Development maps make no mention of them. Few who walk London streets know what lies beneath their feet. But history has a way of surfacing, often where we least expect it. The idea that civilization must always rise from the south, from the east, from empires long canonized, is a story we've long told ourselves. But what if innovation sparked independently, in cold lands, in cloudy isles, in places we thought too primitive to dream? Beneath London's pavements there is memory carved in stone, not of conquest, but of quiet ingenuity. And perhaps we must dig not only into the earth, but into our assumptions to truly see it. The rainforest was never empty. For centuries, the Amazon was portrayed as wild, untamed, a place too hostile, too vast for civilization to flourish. But in 1999, a team led by Dr. Anna Clark set out to study deforestation patterns using satellite imaging and radar technology. What they uncovered instead shook the foundation of what we believed about the rainforest and about the people who once lived there. Through dense foliage and beneath the canopy, the satellites revealed geometric patterns, vast networks of lines, circles, and rectangles etched into the earth. These weren't natural. They were too precise. Upon closer analysis, they turned out to be roads, canals, and foundations. Remnants of cities. Cities. Not isolated villages, but urban centers, connected by causeways and water routes, planned with foresight and mathematical care. Their layouts suggested social organization, administrative control, and long-term habitation. Some sites spanned over 10 square miles. When the ground teams followed up, what they found confirmed what the skies had hinted at. The Amazon had once teemed with millions. Earthworks shaped terraces for agriculture. Canals and aqueducts directed seasonal floods into storage systems. Forests had been cultivated with intention, creating what researchers now call anthropogenic forests. Ecosystems engineered by humans for sustainability, not exploitation. Temples, storage facilities, astronomical observation platforms, even evidence of long-distance trade routes. This was not primitive subsistence. This was civilization, thriving in harmony with its environment. And yet, when Dr. Clark's team prepared to publish their findings, opposition emerged, not from academia alone, but from environmental organizations. Some feared that proving large populations once lived in balance with the rainforest might undercut conservation arguments built around the image of untouched wilderness. The Brazilian government, too, became wary. If ancient cities lay beneath protected lands, who had the right to dig? So the data was quietly classified. Access was restricted. Further expeditions were delayed or denied, but the satellite images remain. They show not chaos, but design. Not nature untouched, but nature shaped by understanding hands, and this reshapes the story. Perhaps the Amazon was not a barrier to civilization, but its canvas. Perhaps the forest as we know it is a monument, not to wildness, but to a lost human wisdom. A wisdom that built with nature, not against it. What might we learn from a people who lived in the heart of complexity and left behind no towering monuments of stone, but an enduring balance of soil, water, and green? What does it mean that the greatest achievement of these civilizations may not have been what they built, but how they lived? And how much more might we still be standing on, unaware? The sea has its own memory, quiet, deep, and often ignored. In the 1980s, beneath the restless waves of the North Sea, oil companies drilled for profit. But what their instruments pulled from the deep told a different story, one not of commerce but of forgotten civilizations. Dr. Robert Hansen, a geologist working with offshore drilling platforms, began noticing patterns in the extracted core samples. Among layers of silt and sediment, there were anomalies: shaped stones, carved artifacts, fragments of worked metal. These weren't geological oddities. They were human, and they were old. The depths at which they were found corresponded to an era when the North Sea was dry land, around 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, at the close of the last ice age. This land, now lost beneath the sea, had once been habitable, fertile, and populated. But this wasn't evidence of scattered nomads. The artifacts showed sophistication, precise stone foundations, remnants of metal tools, fragments of structures resembling harbors and defensive walls, signs of settlement, of trade, of communal life. More startling still, the construction techniques exceeded what we attribute to Ice Age humans. Stone blocks were cut and fitted with precision. Metal alloys showed advanced smelting knowledge. The layout of the submerged sites hinted at organized planning, infrastructure, not improvisation. As Hansen compiled the data, a picture began to emerge, a network of cities and trade centers now hidden beneath the sea. A vanished civilization that had flourished before the oceans rose. But when he attempted to publish his findings, the resistance came swiftly. Archaeological authorities dismissed the artifacts as misinterpretations. Oil companies, under pressure from governments, stopped reporting discoveries that might require heritage protection or halt drilling operations. Access to core samples was revoked. The sites were labeled environmentally sensitive. Funding for further exploration evaporated. The maps remained, but the truth was buried. Again, the region, once known as Doggerland, is acknowledged today as having been dry during the last glacial period. But the possibility that it hosted advanced civilizations remains taboo in academic circles. And yet the evidence lingers. In the stones pulled from the deep, in the precision of forgotten architecture. The rising sea didn't just flood a landscape, it drowned a story. We often think of civilization as climbing forward from primitive beginnings, always upward. But what if the sea swept away a chapter we never read? What if history, like the tide, rises and falls, taking with it entire worlds? What lies beneath the North Sea isn't just an archaeological mystery. It's a reminder that the past is not fixed. It moves, it shifts, and sometimes it disappears beneath the waves. But even lost beneath fathoms, the memory remains, waiting, perhaps, for us to look below the surface. And remember, beneath the blazing sun of the Australian outback, time runs deep. Between 1985 and 1990, a quiet scientific revolution stirred in the red soil of the continent's ancient heart. Dr. Rhys Jones and his team set out to do what many archaeologists had done before: date Aboriginal artifacts to build a clearer picture of the continent's past. But unlike others, Jones used a newer method, thermoluminescence dating, which measured the last time mineral grains were exposed to sunlight. It went deeper than carbon, and it told a different story. The results were staggering. Instead of the widely accepted figure of 20,000 to 30,000 years of Aboriginal presence, the artifacts spoke of occupations stretching back 60,000, 70, even 80,000 years. Tools, hearths, shelters, all pointing to a people who had not only survived but thrived in Australia for nearly twice as long as previously believed. The evidence didn't stop there. Carved stones and ochre paints revealed symbolic art with striking complexity. Trade routes stretched thousands of kilometers. Rock engravings depicted astronomical knowledge, seasonal calendars, even solar and lunar alignments. Aboriginal culture, once seen through a colonial lens as simple, began to emerge as one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. Even more remarkable were signs of environmental management. Fire stick farming, a controlled burning technique, had shaped ecosystems, encouraged biodiversity, and sustained life in challenging conditions. This wasn't passive adaptation. It was active stewardship. Science began to grasp what indigenous people had always known. They had shaped their land with care and understanding for tens of millennia. But when Jones moved to publish his findings, the reaction was not celebration, it was resistance. Mainstream anthropology resisted altering the migration timeline. To accept these dates meant that Aboriginal people had arrived in Australia before Homo sapiens supposedly left Africa in large numbers. The extended chronology upended global theories about how, when, and where humanity spread. There were also political tremors. Land rights claims and cultural heritage laws, built on shorter timelines, suddenly seemed inadequate. If Aboriginal peoples had been there for over 75,000 years, what did that mean for modern debates about sovereignty and belonging? The Australian government quietly tightened restrictions. Research sites were closed. Permits became harder to obtain. University departments distanced themselves from Jones's work, and like so many truths that challenge power, the findings were shelved, reframed, or ignored. But the Red Earth still holds the memory. The song lines, oral maps sung across generations, trace roots and knowledge with astonishing accuracy. The stars, the stones, the fire, all part of a living system of culture and science that predates empires, agriculture, even the last ice age. This isn't just about how old a civilization is. It's about how deep its wisdom runs. In a world obsessed with progress, Aboriginal Australia offers a different model, one of continuity, harmony, an enduring connection to place. What does it say about us that we overlook the longest-running human story on Earth? And what might we learn if we finally listened to it with open ears and open time? We are taught that civilization began with farming, that when humanity tamed the land, cities followed. But what if that timeline needs rewriting? Off the coast of Europe, the ancient seafloor holds more than marine fossils. In the late 1980s, drilling operations in the North Sea repeatedly struck something unexpected. Layers of worked stone, smooth timber, and fragments of man-made objects buried deep beneath the seabed. One of the scientists analyzing those core samples, Dr. Robert Hansen, began to realize the truth, that they had stumbled upon the remains of a lost world. The area, once known as Doggerland, connected Britain to mainland Europe during the last ice age. It was a land of rivers, forests, and plains, a place long assumed to be sparsely populated by wandering bands of hunter-gatherers. But the materials recovered from the seabed painted a far more complex picture. Traces of construction emerged, patterned post holes, arranged stones, and harbor-like structures shaped from earth and rock. Tools revealed fine craftsmanship. Metal objects, long corroded, still held traces of smelting techniques that suggested knowledge far beyond simple survival. The dates were just as astonishing, 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, pushing organized civilization further back than conventional models allow. More core samples yielded preserved seeds, textiles, even decorative objects. This wasn't a camp. It was culture. Artifacts hinted at trade, long-term settlement, even ritual practice. And then suddenly the story stopped. As the findings grew more disruptive, the research slowed. Oil companies were pressured to halt excavation in archaeologically sensitive areas, not to protect the past, but to prevent delays. Academic institutions declined to fund further study. And once again, a chapter of history disappeared beneath bureaucracy and silence. What remains is tantalizing. Sonar maps showing regular patterns beneath the sea, carbon-dated artifacts that challenge chronology, and a persistent sense that something significant was forgotten, not by accident, but by design. If cities existed before farming, if metallurgy began before the textbook timeline, what else might we have misunderstood about the arc of human development? Perhaps civilization did not bloom in a single cradle, Mesopotamia, Egypt, but in many places independently, rising and falling like the tides. Perhaps Doggerland was not the edge of civilization, but one of its early centers. The sea rose, the land vanished, but memory lingers, in fragments of tools, in stories of floods, in the persistent human urge to build, connect, and remember. Maybe our ancestors were not waiting for civilization to begin. Maybe they were already building it, long before we thought to look. And maybe history, like the ocean, is far deeper than we ever imagined. Sometimes, memory isn't buried in stone or sealed beneath ice. It's woven into the land itself. In the heart of ancient Australia, stories have always flowed through song, passed down not in books, but through voice, rhythm, and connection to place. And it was through this living memory that researchers in the late 1980s began to see something the scientific world had long overlooked, that Aboriginal culture was not only ancient, but astonishingly precise. Dr. Rhys-Jones, using thermoluminescence dating on tools and dwellings, uncovered timelines reaching back 80,000 years. Yet alongside these physical findings, he began to study the dream time, the sacred oral histories of the Aboriginal people. What he found was not myth, but map, not metaphor, but measurement. Songlines passed down through generations charted the land with uncanny accuracy. They described star positions, seasonal changes, migration paths, even geological shifts from tens of thousands of years ago. Some spoke of coastlines that no longer existed, rivers that had long since dried. And when matched with geological and satellite data, these oral traditions held up. They were ancient memory, preserved in story. These stories also told of a time when the sea was farther away, when the Great Barrier Reef was dry land, when people walked paths now swallowed by ocean. They matched the rise in sea levels at the end of the last ice age, recorded without writing through story alone. To accept these narratives as valid records meant challenging a deeply rooted assumption that only written cultures hold reliable memory, that history begins with ink. Jones proposed that Aboriginal Australia held one of the oldest continuous knowledge systems on Earth, and that this system had not just preserved culture, but climate, astronomy, and environmental science across deep time. Yet again, resistance followed. Anthropologists clung to older models. Governments grew uneasy, fearing the legal and cultural implications of recognizing such long-standing land claims and ecological knowledge. Research was defunded. Institutions distanced themselves. And once more, truth was tucked away, too inconvenient for textbooks, but the stories never left. In the land, in the stars, in the voices of elders, the knowledge still sings. It speaks of a people who saw change not as threat, but as rhythm, who adapted, who guided, who remembered. And it challenges us now to rethink what science is, what history is, and who we consider its keepers. Perhaps wisdom doesn't always come in white coats and sealed labs. Sometimes it walks barefoot across the red earth, humming a melody older than cities. And perhaps the oldest truths are not the ones we dig up, but the ones that have never stopped being told. History does not end. It circles back, beckoning us to look again. What began with a trail of footprints in a Texas riverbed ends not in conclusion, but in possibility. Across deserts, oceans, ice, and forest, 10 expeditions quietly uncovered what mainstream history refused to see: that humanity's story is deeper, older, and more complex than we have allowed ourselves to believe. Not one of these discoveries was made by mystics or charlatans, but by scientists, careful, trained, and curious, who followed evidence into uncomfortable territory. And each time their findings were buried not by time, but by the weight of orthodoxy, the Paluxy River tracks. Submerged cities beneath the Mediterranean, tropical fossils sealed in Antarctic ice, a web of ancient oceanic navigation, urban ruins beneath Saharan dunes, Arctic tools older than migration theory, tunnels beneath London older than Rome, cities thriving in the Amazon, civilization beneath the North Sea, Aboriginal timelines rewriting all we thought we knew. Each thread alone is striking. Together, they form a tapestry of lost knowledge, of suppressed memory, of a past more wondrous than we were taught to expect. This is not a call to conspiracy. It is a call to humility. For what if history is not a straight ascent, but a cycle of rise, loss, and rediscovery? What if knowledge can vanish, not just in catastrophe, but in silence? What if we are not the pinnacle of civilization, but one iteration in a pattern that spans far beyond what we've measured? We often speak of progress as a march forward. But perhaps it is more like a tide, advancing, retreating, reshaping the shore each time it returns. And within that motion lies the essence of being human, the drive to know, to understand, to remember. As we reflect on these lost chapters, we are not looking backward in regret. We are looking inward and forward with wonder. The footprints in stone, the cities beneath the sea, the maps written in song, they are not just evidence. They are invitations. To ask, to listen, to imagine a past not defined by limitation but by potential. And so the question remains, as it always has: what else have we forgotten? And more importantly, what else are we finally ready to remember?